life, faith, following Christ is all about God's outrageous and extravagant grace. Teresa Briones is a tender, loving mother with a nasty left hook. She was at the laundromat one day with her daughter Alicia. And some kids in the laundromat were making fun of Alicia. They were calling out to their mom, "Mom, look at the monster!" Alicia was 10 years old, but she looked like she was 80. She was bald. She was very, very small. She was 10, but was actually about the size of a preschooler. Weighed less than 22 pounds. She had arthritis in her knees, wrinkles on her skin. Alicia had progeria. It's a rare genetic aging disorder. Most children who get it die before they turn 20. Teresa said to the kids, "My daughter is not an alien, she's not a monster, she has a disease, but she's just like you and me." And she was. Alicia was a bubbly, fun-loving third grader, had lots of friends at her school. She liked to watch TV, play with her Barbies. She picked on her little brother. Teresa, Alicia's mom, was used to people staring at Alicia. And she was patient when people would ask questions, but she would not tolerate insensitivity. Well, the kids in the laundromat kept staring at Alicia and making fun of her. Their mom came over and said, "I see it." And that's when Teresa decked her with the left hook. And as the woman lay sprawled on the floor, Teresa said, "My daughter is not an it." Now, Teresa knew Alicia better than anyone. She knew all her imperfections, all of her limitations. She knew what she looked like, but she loved her anyway. She was her mom. What else would you expect? I'd like to suggest that in the same way, God loves us. He knows us. He knows all our limitations, all our imperfections. He knows the thoughts that run through our minds. The thoughts we don't like to admit to ourselves, much less tell anybody else. God knows all the sins that we have committed in the past and all the evil we will do in the days to come, and He loves us anyway. What an outrageous idea. That's grace. A man went into a grocery store, wanted to buy a can of coffee and a loaf of bread. Got his eyes, walked up to the checkout register. Got there about the same time as a lady who had a cart overflowing with groceries, clothes, and DVD players. It was one of those stores you could get anything and everything, and she had anything and everything in her cart. But she was nice. She let him go ahead. So he walked up and they waited in line, got up to the register, and the clerk pointed to a fishbowl. He said, "Take one of the tickets in there. It tells you what discount you get. There's even one in there that says you get everything for free." And reached in, pulled it out. The ticket said, "Everything free." And the man thought to himself, "What a waste. All I've got is a can of coffee and the bread." He turned around to the woman behind him and said, "Guess what, honey? We won. We don't have to pay for anything." So they went up, unloaded all their stuff, stood side by side, and had a few moments of temporary wedded bliss. loaded up the carts, went out. She gave him a hug, and they went their separate ways. Think of the story she had to tell. Now, the ethics of that may be a little questionable, but I really think that free groceries is our story. God's grace is a surprise. We don't deserve it. It's free. All we have to do is accept it. Say thank you. One little difference. The lady who had that cart full of stuff, she knew it was going to cost a lot of money, but she could afford to pay it. What we owe, we could never pay. But God has paid it for us. That is extravagance. That is grace. Today is my last sermon here at Beulah. I didn't actually add them up, but in 9.5 years, I figured I preached between 100 and 120 sermons. Taught hundreds of different classes. If there was one message I hope you have heard in 9.5 years, it's the message of grace. Think about it. You're alive today not because you deserved to be born. The talents and opportunities that have come your way are not something you deserve, they're a gift. God's love for you, God's salvation, is something you don't have to work for. In fact, sometimes you have received God's love in spite of what you have done. God's grace is overwhelming, furious, staggering, relentless, reckless, and stubborn. And when you receive God's grace, you're simply called to say thank you and then be gracious to someone else. I'm convinced that this is one of the central messages of the Bible. It's in both the Old and the New Testament. That's why I like to teach on the Old Testament, to show that God's grace is throughout the Bible. But if I had to pick one passage on grace, I would pick our passage from Ephesians. By grace you have been saved through faith. Now, this passage is challenging in one sense, and fairly difficult. I looked at the commentaries. There's a lot there. And it's in some ways not at all simple. And I could go on for hours teaching and explaining, and you know I like to teach, but won't do that today. Because although it's a complex message, it's really pretty simple. Verses 1 through 3 tell us that we're all dead. That's what sin does. It kills us. Verses 4 through 7 tell us that although we are dead, God has made us alive. And I love verse 5. I'd never noticed this before. Paul can't wait to get his main statements. So before, right in the middle, he just adds in, you're saved by grace. And then verses 8 through 10 develop that. Your salvation is by grace. You receive it through faith, but even your faith is not something you do, it's something God has done in you and for you. And then verse 10 talks about how we respond by doing the works that God prepared. Even the works of your life are God's grace to you. In other words, God gets the credit for everything, for your life, for your salvation, for the works that you do, for the ministry that you have done, for the ministry I have done. It's all God's grace. A few years ago, I was reading through Reader's Digest. One of the little blurbs, on the bottom, how they have those little sayings, one of them caught my attention. My greatest fear is that I will be standing behind Mother Teresa in the final judgment line, and I'll hear God tell her, "You should have done more." Mother Teresa should have done more. So should you. You should have loved more. You should have sinned less. You don't deserve the blessings you have received. It's free. It's grace. Heard it said a number of years ago that every preacher has at most 2 or 3 sermons. Repeated in a variety of different ways, but basically they're the same message. If I had one to pick, it would be the message of grace. I never get tired of preaching grace, and I'm convinced that no one ever gets to the point where they don't need to hear about God's grace. 2 reasons I think grace is continually needed. First, we all keep sinning, and therefore we need to be forgiven, which is an act of God's grace. Oh, we pretend we don't. I mean, we say, yeah, I sin, but we don't really admit it to each other. We put on our Sunday best and come across to others as if we are good people, but those who are closest to us usually can tell us the truth. We're sinful, selfish, filled with pride. We need grace. But there's a second reason I think grace is so important, and that's the fact that many people don't really believe it. Don't believe that God loves us. 2002, there was a poll taken in the United States. I think it was titled Religion and Ethics. The poll showed, it's been nearly 11 years ago, but I doubt it's changed much. 75% of all Americans believe that what we do, how we act, will determine whether or not we get into heaven. 75%. Now, I know that everyone here is part of the 25. I mean, I've preached it. How could you miss it? But let me tell you a little secret that some of you already know. The reason I preach grace is that although I know it, I don't really know it. I know grace in my head. I don't always know it in my heart. I understand the concept of grace, but I haven't fully grasped the truth of grace. I spend too much of my time trying to please God, too much energy hoping I'm accepted by God, too much effort worrying about what God thinks of me. I need God's grace. Mike Yaconelli is one of my spiritual mentors. In a number of his writings and conferences I've been to, had something he wrote I loved. He wrote, "Most of my life I heard the message loud and clear that Christianity was all about coloring within the lines and coloring well. If I was a good Christian, if I loved Jesus and wanted to please him, if I read my Bible, prayed, and went to church, then I would get better and better at coloring. And if I lived a long and godly life, I would eventually be able to draw close to the perfect drawing. What I am suggesting is that God's grace is so outside the lines of our understanding that we can only stand in awe and wonder." And I love this. "Christianity is not about learning how to live within the lines. Christianity is about the joy of coloring. It's God's outrageous and extravagant grace." Max Lucado tells the story of a woman who was married to a man who was not very nice. Every morning before he went to work, he would write up a list of jobs that she was expected to do that day. Stack the firewood, scrub the floors, wash the windows, balance the checkbook, and on it would go. And if she hadn't finished the list by the time he got home from work, he would explode, sometimes verbal, sometimes physical abuse. And even if she had finished the list, he would usually find something to complain and criticize. After a number of years, several years, he died. She was by herself for a while. Eventually, years later, she married another man. A man who lavished on her love and tenderness. One day she was going through sorting a box of papers. She found one of the lists that her first husband had written. As she read through the list, tears started coming down her face. She realized she still did all those chores. But she thought to herself, no one has to tell me to do them. I do them because I love my husband. Friends, we are called to do good works. God prepared works for us to be our way of life. But we need to know that our good works, the obedience we give, the things we do are not so that God loves us. They are because God loves us. Our works are a response to God's grace, and even the ability to do those works is an act of grace. Now, I won't go into great detail, but I'd like to make one suggestion about the works we are called to do. We are to respond to God's grace in our lives by being gracious to others. We have received grace. Therefore, give grace. Look around. There is not one person in here who is perfect. There is no one in this room who deserves the blessings of your life. No one who deserves the salvation you have received. Everyone in this room, everyone we know, makes mistakes. Everyone we sins. Everyone needs grace. So if you have received grace, share it with those around you. Friends, it's all about God's outrageous and extravagant grace. It's all about God's amazing grace. Amen. Amen. Let's stand and sing and celebrate God's amazing grace.